I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling, written to be performed and then recorded in one single, flawless take. Every new episode of SKALD is the best episode yet, so don't worry about listening from the beginning. Just dive right in with this episode. And if you want to catch up on what you've missed later on, you can always go back or check out the prose volumes on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 51. Maul wasn't the same man. Something inside of him had been lost. Something was gone, stolen, missing, something beyond the obvious, beyond the grisly surgery, the one they had inflicted upon him after forcing him to inhale that noxious weed. The anchor. The gruesome operation that had left him a mess of scars and throbbing, endless phantom pains. The one meant to turn him, a rampaging stallion, into an obedient gelding. Maul remained, however, far from obedient. He would never kneel willingly. He would never kneel at all unless it was his dying act on a battlefield, weapon in hand, falling to the earth amidst the blood and the gore and the gasping breaths of his enemies. He was a king. The one true king of men, the one true king of flames and ashes. But while he remained uncowed, unbroken, while he refused to submit to anyone, something within him was gone. The fire. That hungry flame that gnawed at his gut, that seared his heart, that caused his lungs to spasm, desperate to escape its heat. For the first time in as long as he could remember, for the first time in his entire life, that fire was gone. He was still full of hate and anger. It would take much more than castration to exorcise those demons from one such as Maul. There was nothing else. Nothing that came next. The fire, the flame, the madness, the drive, and the passion, they were all gone. They had been stolen from him, like his childhood, his throne, his home, his birthright, and his only friend, like SKALD. They had been taken from him. Unlike those earlier thefts, which only served to fan the fire within him, only served to drive him forward, leading him down the dark, flame-filled path that he saw spreading out before him. This most recent crime robbed him of the desire to take revenge, the desire to take back what was his, the desire to lash out, the desire to do anything. Surgery, the butchering that he endured wasn't the worst of it. That damage, while painful, while excruciating, was merely incidental, little more than cosmetic. Maul had no desire for a family, no yearning to establish a great and mighty line. No. He wanted the throne for himself and himself only, with all that came after damned for all he cared. The surgery, the butchering, was just damage to his body, nothing more. Damage to his shell, the one that he now inhabited, cold and more alone than he had ever thought possible. His drive, his passion, his fire, his madness, they were all gone, but his strength remained. They had left that untouched. So when he had just barely healed, enough that he could move without tearing the wide, lazy stitches that crisscrossed his ruined body, the proctors came again, this time with chains and with collars. They placed them on Maul. They told him to be a good boy. And he obeyed. The sensation wasn't an unfamiliar one. The flimsy loincloth they gave him to cover his shame, his ruined body, the chains that pulled tightly on his wrists and ankles, their barked orders and commands, issued without concern for the agony he endured. Maul had been there before. He had experienced this before. Enlith, her father, his guards, their ropes, their taunts, and the tree, that massive celestial ash, that arboreal wonder. The world tree. Maul braced himself for the all-consuming hate, the passion, the madness that inevitably came when he thought on his captivity, when he thought upon the years he had spent strapped to that massive tree. He girded his mangled loins, and he waited for the madness, waited for the rage to overtake him, the fury that he had depended on for his entire life, that which had given him the means and the power to take back what was his, what was rightfully his. He gritted his teeth. He prepared himself for the pain that would inevitably follow his fight with the guards, and he experienced nothing. He felt nothing. Nothing happened. He was an empty shell, a dried husk of a man. Though he hated being held prisoner, though he hated his captors, though he wanted to tear their throats with his teeth and spit them out amongst the ashes of that churning, stinking city, the one that he wished to see burnt to cinders. He couldn't. He couldn't do anything. Because what was the point? What was the point of any of it? He had been captured. He had been cowed. He had been broken. He frowned severely, angrily even. But when he opened his mouth to issue threats, curses, and promises of soul-shattering devastation, all that emerged was a sigh. To be trapped is one thing. It's bad enough. It's the worst thing. But Maul was trapped inside his own body, trapped with no way out, trapped with no way to even free himself, trapped with nothing left to do but to sigh and shuffle down the long, steep, darkening set of stone stairs that the proctors pointed him toward. As he plodded down those stairs, devoid of purpose or pride, the stones grew hotter and hotter, scalding the bottoms of his bare feet, the ones that had just recently grown accustomed to the cold, still air of that dying world. The heat, darkness, the slow, crushing inevitability, it all brought him to mind. Maul's mind moved to him, the one who had promised him so much, the one who had betrayed him, the one who had ruined his mind with an unprotected fall through the roiling underneath, and most crucially, the one to whom Maul had prayed, had pledged allegiance, had pleaded with for succor, the one to whom he had dedicated himself in fury, in rage, and in unspeakable agony. It wasn't the fire. It wasn't the flame. It wasn't the heat that had warmed Maul during a lifetime of suffering. But it was a spark, and he felt it flare up ever so briefly within him. Maybe there was some of it left. Maybe there was enough heat left to rebuild the flame. All he needed were the right ingredients. All he needed was fuel, fuel that he could provide if he was willing. And when was he not willing to throw fuel upon the fire, upon the sacred flame, the cathartic blaze, the inevitable spark that burned at the core of all creation? Maul looked back at the proctor, grinning. That scowling fool, that cruel imbecile, he had no idea what was in store for him. He could not even conceive of the destruction that Maul would mete out upon him, his line, upon his entire world. Maul would burn cities to ashes. He would tear up the crops. He would salt the earth. He would turn this world and all others into a barren, gray cemetery, and he would rule over that ruined wasteland until he too fell to ashes. Maul was ready. The drive, the passion, the madness, the fire was still missing. It hadn't returned, but Maul wanted it to return, wanted him to once again give what he had promised, to give Maul what he was owed, what was rightfully his. Though Maul reached out, though he reached down, though he endeavored to dig down deep into that awful roiling underneath, the only depths he plumbed were those he could reach by foot. Ones that the proctors prodded him down towards. And as they forced him down that final flight of stairs, as he was forced into the massive cavern that lay beneath the city, the spark within him weakened, faded, and died. The desire, the drive, the passion, the madness, and the fire left him as he saw the truth, as he saw what he had become, saw perhaps what he had always been. He was in chains, held in bondage, and he was set to work, the same as the rest of them, the same as all the other slaves. All the cavern held was work, struggle, and backbreaking labor. And all of that work, every ounce of activity, centered around one point, working in service of it while fearfully avoiding it, moving to and fro in that sweltering heat, that air made heavy with sweat and with tears, always making sure that they stayed out of reach, that they cut a wide berth around the Titan. Maul found it revolting and terrifying in equal measure. But he also felt a kinship with that monster, with that awful, heaving colossus. Its head was enormous, large enough to take up and swallow a grown man whole. And Maul needed to spend no more than an hour in that cavern to see the Titan do just that. Maul understood the beast on some primal, indescribable level, because not only was he too now in chains, but he had spent too much of his life, far too much of his life, held prisoner by those who would use him to further their own selfish ends. The Titan's head was oversized, even for the massive body that it emerged from, the one that lay prone and bloated, with countless arms and legs sticking out at odd angles, withered and atrophied from lack of use. As though the Titan, like Maul in his wasted, stolen youth, had been restrained, he had chosen not to fight against it. While tied to the world tree, Maul had struggled endlessly, day upon day, night upon night, flexing his muscles in a state of constant exertion until eventually he gave up, exhausted, then regained his strength and inevitably began again. Thus, He had not only maintained his natural, prodigious strength, but had grown and cultivated it to frightening levels, nurturing the power in his limbs even as he fed the growing fire in his belly. But now, things were different. Now Maul was different. Like the monster, like that titan, like that chained colossus, Maul was missing something. They had both been stripped of their drive and their desire. The flame in their guts had been extinguished. The titan was empty on the inside, and it was Maul's job, Maul's responsibility to fill that gaping gut, to fill it with load after load of the thick, mealy slop that sloshed over the edges of the wheelbarrow as Maul guided it over the uneven floor. The titan wanted to feed. The titan needed to feed. The titan needed to be fed. And if the loads of slop, of chunky, uneven meal didn't come fast enough, then the titan would take matters into its own hands, would shoot out those withered arms, the ones that, devoid of stamina, still held a shocking degree of natural strength. It would reach out. He would take up whatever worker was closest, whatever slave drew nearest, and the titan would punish them for their sloth, for their laziness, would punish them by taking them between his teeth and grinding them into paste, their screams echoing off the walls of the cavern. Aside from those sudden, terrible outbursts of violence, the monster laid, for the most part, motionless. Maul didn't know what the beast's purpose was. If it had been up to him, he would have simply put it out of its misery. He would have wielded the blade himself, or perhaps just walled up that nightmarish cavern, leaving the heaving colossus alone to either starve to death or carve out some new, better place for itself. He would have left the beast to its own devices, to succeed or fail on its own merits, just as all mortal men were left alone by their gods, left heaving, left dying, left weeping in the darkness. And the monster did weep. When the titan wasn't eating, and sometimes, even when it was, the monster wept. Long, hard, wincing and letting out unintelligible cries, a language heavy, harsh, guttural, and slow, a dialect befitting such a colossal monster. It yelped and it writhed in agony at regular intervals, whenever the tubes lining its back, the ones that dug deep into its pocked, quivering skin, whenever they began their suction. Maul could only guess what the tubes took out of the beast, but he knew that whatever it was pained the monster greatly. Perhaps it was the fuel for the titan's fire, the flame that should have been burning brightly within the monster's very core. Perhaps its captors sought to deprive the flame, to starve it out as Maul would have done to the beast itself. Whatever it was that the tubes pulled out of the titan, whatever comprised that bubbling green substance, the one that the savage could see through those wide, translucent tubes, there was one thing that Maul could see exceptionally clearly: that its removal tortured the titan. But the tubes weren't the only equipment attached to the monster. They weren't the only instruments stapled and bolted to the poor beast's pocked, quivering skin. Because as Maul took load after load of that thick, fetid gruel back and forth, over and over again, he watched in horror, in disgust, and in a rare show of sympathy as he saw groups of workers urged forward by the staves, by the spears, and by the whips of the proctors, watched them approach the titan's exposed belly. There, timidly and quickly, so as to escape notice as the Titan gorged itself on load after load of that malodorous slop. They attached a different set of tubes, tipped with broad bases that stapled into the monster's pocked, quivering flesh. Wide, rounded cups that they placed directly over the bulbous, black nipples that dotted the poor creature's underbelly. Whatever they pulled from the creature's back clearly wasn't enough. Not for them, not for those cruel, cold, callous proctors. Maul ground his teeth, disgusted by the behavior. It was one thing to kill a beast for sustenance, to take its flesh into your own, to allow it to serve a higher purpose, to let it become fuel for a man with a destiny. But it was another to hold it captive, to drain it of its very essence, to reduce a mighty, impressive creature to nothing but quivering livestock, to be kept alive long enough to milk it of all it possessed, then discard it when it no longer served a purpose. Once again, Maul felt an undeniable kinship with the Titan, though the sight of his jiggling jowls and distended underbelly still sickened him to look upon. Maul tried to focus on the work, on the mindless, endless tasks before him, his responsibility to keep the Titan fed, the necessity to keep its jaws processing that gruel, lest the beast find a more human target for its hungers. But it was impossible for Maul to block out what was happening, for him to ignore the torture that the monster endured as the tubes drained from its back that bubbling green liquid, and from its belly that thick white substance that flowed down the tubes in sickening spurts. Though the sight of that thick white ooze sickened him, what he saw next made his stomach churn, because the tubes, those cruel tubes, the ones attached to the rounded cups that had been stapled to the beast's stomach, they led to massive vats, heated by low fires, tended to by hungry-looking slaves that ladled out a steaming version of that thick, light liquid, which was then readily devoured by Maul's fellow slaves. They ate it. No, eat was too delicate, too refined of a word. They devoured it. They shoved their faces into the long, shallow bowls, and they lapped it up like the animals they had allowed themselves to become. They labored to enslave the beast, just as they were enslaved, and they worked to deprive it of its very essence so that they might be nourished to continue enslaving the beast. Maul's head spun with disgust and with anger, horrified at the cyclical nature of these workers, these slaves' existence, horrified at the nature of his own existence as he shuffled along in line, moving closer and closer to those steaming vats. What choice did he have? What choice did he ever have? It was work, feed, be fed, work, and feed again. That and death, certain, inevitable death, were his only options. Could he be blamed for, at the very least, clinging to what life, damaged and tortured though it may be, clinging to what little life he had left in his bones? He couldn't. He reassured himself that he couldn't, that there was no choice as he raised the long, shallow bowl. And he lowered his face into it. The odor was rank, foul, putrid, but it was still far, far better than the taste. Maul gagged as he tried to choke down the pungent liquid. Taste. It was like nothing he had ever experienced. It was sweet and rich with nourishment, but also overripe, like juice from a rotted fruit. Though he couldn't have named the flavor, he knew that it was evil, Unnatural, not to be consumed by mortal men, a fact he saw backed up by his fellow slaves, the ones that, after gorging themselves on the liquid, keeled over and died. It was poison. They ate poison so that they could extract poison. Poison that the slaves ate before it finally, inevitably, had its way with them, before it sent them pitching forward upon the rough, scorching stones that lined that massive, nightmarish cavern. Maul watched in horror as the bodies were scraped off the ground, by their fellow slaves, of course, and removed to another part of the cavern, to the cook area, the one where Maul returned again and again with his wheelbarrow. His wheelbarrow. Maul had left it while he devoured his putrid, poisonous meal, but when he turned around to retrieve it, it was gone, stolen from him. The thief hadn't gone far. He couldn't go far. The old man was clearly racked with disease, no doubt brought on by years of poisonous meals, or perhaps mere months, mere weeks, mere days that had aged the slave far before his time. The old man, or the young man made old, staggered forward with the wheelbarrow, moving slowly toward the cook area. In fact, all of the slaves were on the move. Though Maul had barely finished choking down that thick, putrid milk, his fellow slaves couldn't wait to get back to work. Maul was puzzled. He was confused, and he felt the anger that so often accompanied his confusion begin to boil over inside of him. But as he watched, understanding dawned on him. The staves, the spears, and the whips, they weren't the only tools that the proctors wielded on their slaves. They also used fear. Fear of the staves, of the spears, and of the whips, twisted it to force their slaves in another direction, in a new direction, and the direction they chose. But they also had another weapon at their disposal, a powerful tool that they wielded adroitly. Praise and reward. The proctors called out, promising rewards to the slaves who got back to work the quickest, to the ones who worked the hardest, to the ones who accomplished the most. And that reward? Additional food, an extra serving of that putrid milk, more poison to pour down their pitiable gullets. That, and the chance to begin work sooner, the next day, to be the first admitted into the caverns for their shift, the opportunity to work more, work harder, to consume more of the liquid death that would see them ground up and transformed into that disgusting gruel. Proctors, in a skillful maneuver, turned the slaves' hate, their anger, their misery, turned it around, forced them to direct it at one another and themselves, driving them back to the work they were condemned to the work that would surely be the death of them. It was a horrifying, vicious cycle, a miserable, meaningless existence promoted by cruel, unfeeling masters. And the most shocking part is that it worked on the mindless, pitiful slaves as well as on Maul. And what choice did he have? What choice did he have? He knew the answer. He knew that it was either this or torture, either this or death, either this or those awful, grinning proctors would find something else that they could dig in and take from him with their awful, terrible tools. He had no choice. He had no other option but to rush forward, to shove the old man to the ground with a curse that burned his lips as it passed through them, to kick the ancient, cowering slave once, twice, 3 times, to feel his brittle ribs crack under his royal feet, to take up his wheelbarrow and get back to work. Insolent fool! Maul spat on the old man, who now lay weeping, the palms of his hands steaming as he tried to push himself up off those hot stones. If I am to live as a slave, it will at least be as you're better. I shall be king of the slaves! But as Maul marched back to the cook area, another man, gnarled and ancient, but with the voice of a young child, came up behind him and spoke matter-of-factly. We are no slaves, friend. You would do well to remember that. Maul laughed, shaking the chains that hung from his wrists. Not slaves? Then explain these. Explain this miserable work, this hell of a cavern we're in. The man frowned and shook his head. It's simple. It couldn't be more simple. The work we do, it's hard, but it's menial. It's mindless. It's worthless. Anyone could do it. Maul grunted. Say something useful with your next breath, or shut your mouth, slave! The man looked ancient, tired, and exhausted. Flames flashed in his eyes. We are not slaves. The work we do must be done, but it isn't worth much. Not even enough to sustain us. Maul laughed again. How is that even possible? If it's worth doing, it's worth doing. Speak plainly. The slave sighed. We are not slaves. We're workers. It's just, this is the only life our work can earn us. He glared at Maul before staggering past him, cutting ahead in the line to the cook area. We are not slaves. Maul didn't understand the difference. And more importantly, he didn't want to understand the difference. All he wanted to do was to continue, to block out the agony of his shattered psyche with the pain that comes from hard work, the suffering brought on by unspeakable labors. And this fool, this coward, this slave would push him aside, would try to get ahead of Maul, of King Maul, the one true king of men, the one true king of flames and ashes? No. Maul couldn't allow it. He wouldn't allow it. So he reached down and grabbed the slave's foot. He pulled back roughly, causing the slave to tumble face down upon the stones. And then, not finished yet, Maul dropped his own wheelbarrow and reached down to seize the other man's. He used the savage strength contained within him, the power that had not yet been corrupted by that poisonous filth, that putrid milk. He raised the wheelbarrow over his head and he flung it off into the distance, where it collided into one slave, crushing his fragile bones under its weight before it was taken up by another, eager to work more, to work harder, to work better, so that he might do the same tomorrow, the day after, and the day after that, until he fell, collapsed, died, and was forgotten. As Maul marched on, past the weeping slave, the insolent fool who dared to correct him, to correct a king, Maul made a A silent prayer, a desperate plea for aid. He reached out and down. He dug deep, reaching toward that roiling underneath, the terrifying, riotous essence that coursed through all of existence. He reached out to him, and once again, he begged for succor. He promised him anything if he would just reach out and free him. No, not free him, but give him the strength that he might free himself, just as he had promised that he would, that he always would. Maul knew just how desperate his plea was. Not because he was a traitor, not because he had gone back on deal after deal after deal, but because of his essence and what little Maul knew of it. He was shrouded in mystery, an enigma enveloped by blackened flame, but Maul knew enough to know this. He abhorred slavery. He abhorred slavery, as he abhorred all things that saw one man utterly beholden to another, that saw one man's freedom, one man's essence, sacrificed to prop up a lesser one. Maul knew that he hated slavery, that he reviled it so deeply that he would never come to the aid of those culpable in it. Maul also knew this, knew the most crucial bit, that to his eyes, the slavers weren't the only ones culpable in slavery. He placed blame also upon the broken, cowed backs of the slaves themselves, the ones who willingly allowed themselves to become slaves, the ones who allowed their drive, their passion, their hunger, and their fire to be extinguished, snuffed out by cowardice, starved into darkness by weakness. He reached out to him. He called out to him with silent, frantic prayers. He begged for help, but he heard nothing. He knew it was useless, a futile endeavor, because there, in that hot, fetid, terrible cavern, the nightmarish cave that existed to suck the essence, to drain the humanity out of all those who entered it, he, having accepted his fate, having allowed himself to be made a slave, to have been debased, to have been turned into cattle, no better than that disgusting, ravenous Titan, Maul knew that he was alone. I hope you're enjoying SKALD. If you are, and you haven't already, please leave the show a good review on iTunes. Reviews are the best way to get the show seen by new listeners. They are crucial to SKALD's growth. McGee4212 says, epic of ancient quality. Phenomenal story told with passion and skill, not found in any podcast of its like. I listen to about a dozen podcasts, many tabletop-based and others story-driven like this, and few compare to the skill of storytelling as well as its delivery. Grimdark and pleasurable. I'd say, give it a try. Reviews are great, but the best way to help out the show is through a small monthly donation on Patreon. SKALD is completely ad-free, which is great, but it also means that I need to rely upon fan support to keep the show going. If you enjoy the time, work, energy, and love that goes into SKALD, please sign up to support the show today at patreon.com/SKALD. I always love hearing from SKALD fans on social media. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Snapchat. Or hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more, including my comics work, like Street Fighter G.I. Joe, in stores right now. Last time, I told you about the new podcast collective, Dark Myths, as well as one of my favorite shows under that banner, Twilight Histories. This week, however, I'm going to talk to you about another Dark Myths show. Glenn Roger Gibbs and Daniel Daughtry's The Lesser Bonapartes. The Lesser Bonapartes is a history podcast, but it's not just any history podcast. It's the history podcast that shoots the tube and gleams the half-pipe. They might even ride the gnar, bomb pools, and just outright shred. The Lesser Bonapartes is completely unlike those super dry history podcasts you might have heard in the past. These guys take the novel approach of actually having fun while they talk about history. Daniel and Glenn have already done something like 90 episodes. But if you're feeling overwhelmed and don't know where to start, don't worry. Hop in with their May 2nd, 2015 episode, The James Gang Part 1, Missouri Loves Company, and take it from there. You can and should find The Lesser Bonapartes on iTunes, Stitcher, and at thelesserbonapartes.libsyn.com. That's spelled THELESSERBONAPARTES.LIBSYN.com. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.